Glen Weyl is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research in New York. He works on political economy and social technology. His recent book, Radical Markets, is available in bookstores, and you can get a 30% discount with this document here, or online, I guess. It's called Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. I'm looking forward to it. He develops this ideology through research, communication, activism, and entrepreneurship. And now I'm going to quote from this introduction that I found on the website. It says, and I quote, "In my spare time, I teach at Princeton University." And I'm like, what? You teach in your spare time at Princeton University? I'm like, in my spare time, I painted my garage door last weekend. So I'm thinking that we all need to think about what we do in our spare time a little more carefully. But anyway, I appreciate Glenn taking spare time to come and talk to us tonight.
Yeah,
So
pleasure, Jay. Thanks for having me. And before I get started, I just wanted to call out Eduardo Azevedo is in the audience with us. He's a co-author of mine, a collaborator on a recent white paper that I just put out about auctions, which I think is quite relevant to this community. So I hope you all get to know him, and I think he has a lot of interesting things to bring to you all as well. So I think many people got interested in blockchain, and especially within Ethereum, not so much just because of the technology, but because they were concerned about sort of the rising both centralization of power and rising inequality within our societies, and thought that there might be a possibility that technologies like blockchain could help us address these problems. Unfortunately, despite all the advances in the technology, there is increasing concern, I think, of many within the blockchain community that at best, the vision of how that will all work out in terms of the actual social institutions is unclear. And maybe at worst, there are actually features built into the existing frameworks that are actually tending towards the sort of plutocratic outcomes that many of us got interested in this stuff precisely to avoid. So what I want to talk about today is a book that I wrote with Eric Posner that was not really aimed at blockchain at all. It was aimed at how do we come up with a set of rules for a decentralized but egalitarian society. And Vitalik Buterin, who you all are familiar with, read about some of these ideas and got really engaged with them for these reasons. And that's blossomed into a collaboration, not just between me and Vitalik. We put out a recent working paper, but I think more broadly between the Ethereum community and the community of folks like me and Eduardo, who are thinking about mechanisms that we can use to build a more just society. So before I get into the details of those mechanisms, which is really what the book is all about, I want to give you a broader vision of sort of what sort of ideology or society we're imagining. And to do that, I want you to sort of suspend your practical concerns for a moment and come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictive city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So the defining feature of Marketopia is that all of the major private property, the houses and the land and the airplanes and factories and so forth, let's put aside for the moment, your pets or family heirlooms and so forth. But all of the major wealth is continually up for auction to the highest bidder, who's allowed to possess that asset as long as she satisfies two conditions. First of all, she has to pay that bid that she submitted as a monthly rental payment into a common pool. And second, she has to stand ready to surrender that asset to anyone who comes along and outbids her for control of it. And this principle is applied in Marketopia not just to things you might usually consider private property, but also to collective decisions like who should be the mayor of Marketopia, Where should the parks be located, et cetera. Except rather than selling that to the single highest bidder, instead there are a bunch of alternatives, different people running for mayor. We're going to add up the bids that everyone has on those different alternatives, and whichever one gets the highest total bid is going to be selected. And all the revenue that's raised in this process is continually refunded to the citizens in Marketopia in equal shares as what you might call a universal basic income, what I call a social dividend. Much as in Alaska and Norway, the revenue that they raise from the oil is used in the common interest in Alaska as a social dividend, in Norway to fund public goods. Okay, so when you hear this, your first reaction might be that this is sort of the most extreme version of a free market you can possibly imagine, something that even Adam Smith couldn't have dreamed up in a fever dream. Because in this world, the market is so much more extreme than the free market that we associate with our present society. In our present society, we think we live in a free market, but most things are not actually available for competitive bidding the way that, pork bellies are, right? If you had a better use for this building, you couldn't just go and buy it at some competitive price. You'd have to enter into some long, drawn-out negotiation with the current owner, and they'd get wind of the idea that you had something really creative to do with it. They'd charge you some exorbitant price to try to get as much as they could of that, and they'd probably, in the end, ruin the whole project and stop it from going through. So that's kind of provocative. It makes you realize maybe free markets aren't exactly what we think they are, but it probably doesn't sound very desirable to you either. You probably think to yourself, in a world where everything is constantly up for auction, aren't the wealthy going to dominate everything? Aren't they just going to control all the resources, buy up everything, and milk it for all it's worth? But then you have to ask yourself, well, what do you mean by wealthy? What does it mean to be wealthy? It means to have things like businesses and stocks and airplanes and land and so forth. But in Marketopia, no one possesses any of those things. By the very rules of the system, all the benefits are equally distributed among all citizens, and every citizen has an equal right to use that value that they receive to contest for control of the assets. In that sense, Marketopia is a far more thoroughgoing implementation of the idea of common ownership advocated by people like Karl Marx than is any communist system that ever existed, which inevitably turned into the dictatorship of a small bureaucratic elite that was far more iron than the capitalist oppressors that they claimed to replace, right? Yet in Marketopia, by the very rules of the system, no one's able to accumulate that much power. The rules of the system dictate a broad distribution of the money that's raised, and they allow anyone to compete for control of assets and collective decisions. So that sounds like a paradox to people who grew up in the Cold War or post-Cold War worlds that most of us are familiar with, where capitalism and socialism are supposed to be two opposite ends of some spectrum, where the free market and socialism are supposed to be opposites. But it's not at all unfamiliar to the people who invented modern economic thought, people like Leon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, who were the founders of what's called the marginal revolution. Some of you may be familiar with Tyler Cowen's blog called The Marginal Revolution. Well, it's named after these guys. And they believed that you had to have common ownership in order to have true competition. And this idea, while they were in some ways the originators, was most closely associated with this gentleman here. Now, for those of you who have not read the book, can anyone identify who this person is? Raise your hand if, when I put this guy up before I mentioned his name, you knew who he was. Fair number of people. How about this guy? Most of you? But nobody's heard of this guy. Nobody recognizes him. So He's actually outsold the previous two guys combined by a factor of 3. He was the best-selling book in the English language other than the Bible for 30 years. He inspired the Chinese Revolution against the Qin dynasty in much the way that Marx inspired the Russian Revolution against the Romanovs. And he was, really one of the most influential political thinkers of all time. His name is Henry George. And his ideas were largely forgotten, as is evident here, in the public's imagination because there was little room for him in the debate during the Cold War between capitalism and communism because he had a different vision. But he was not entirely forgotten. His ideas continued to develop in the academy as the field of mechanism design, led especially by William Vickrey, who won the Nobel Prize along with several other people for these ideas. But while they originally imagined this as a transformative set of ideas that could really change the foundations of society and solve some of the great problems of inequality and injustice, in practice, this has, through the increasing specializations of disciplines, instead mostly become a way that Facebook prices its ads and that Google does the same rather than living up to its transformative potential. And the goal of this book is really to show you the way in which these ideas can change some of our fundamental social institutions. So why does it make sense to think about changing fundamental social institutions at this moment? I think as a society, we're really facing a bit of a crisis. There's been a dramatic increase in inequality that many of you are familiar with. On the left here shows the share of income going to the top 1 and top 0.1% of the income distributions, which has roughly doubled from the 1970s until today. And at the same time, on the right here in purple, we've shown the decline in the share of income accruing to people who work rather than to capitalists. Now, you might say that that's kind of fine as long as this is stimulating a more dynamic, competitive, technologically driven society. And that's the argument that many people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and so forth made. Cut taxes, reduce regulations, maybe we'll get more inequality, but we'll get more dynamic growth that will lift all boats. But in fact, at precisely the same time that taxes and regulations have been going down, we've actually had an increase in the taxes on the economy, I would argue. What do I mean by taxes? Well, it's not only government that can charge taxes. In fact, one of the main ways that government, including in the state of Pennsylvania, raise tax revenue is by having monopolies. There's a monopoly on liquor in this state, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And rather than charging a tax on beer and alcohol, the state has a monopoly that charges a tax on all those things. So if you want to think about the overall taxes weighing on the economy, you can't just look at the government taxes. You have to look at all the monopolies within the economy. And economists have tried to measure this, and what they've found is that far more than any government taxes have gone down, there's been a dramatic increase in the taxes charged by monopoly. This is what economists call the markup. And if you plot this in gold here on an inverse scale, you see how closely it tracks the decline in the share of income going to labor. So just as we've seen this decline in labor income, actually that's been tracking right along with this dramatic increase in the profits that are being collected as monopoly rents that are falling as taxes on work. And if that's right, and if you believe the standard, supply-side rhetoric, the rhetoric which says that lower taxes are necessary for faster growth, then you should expect to see right along with this increase in inequality and decline in the rewards to work, dramatic decreases in productivity growth and in economic growth. And that's what we've seen throughout the wealthy world. growth rates are half in the last decade or 2 decades what they were in the 20 or 30 years following World War II. And that's true not just in the United States, it's actually much more dramatically true in Europe, where growth rates are about a tenth what they were in that previous period. So we've seen this combination of rising inequality and economic stagnation, what in the book we call stagnequality, which is a really ugly word, but it's an uglier phenomenon. So we think it's appropriate. And this stagnequality is increasingly discrediting the economic orthodoxies of today, the sort of neoliberal ideas that came into fashion with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. These are increasingly being discredited in the same way that stagflation in the 1970s, which was contrary to the theories of the time that you had to accept inflation to get growth, discredited the Keynesian orthodoxy of that time. And this discrediting of existing economic ideas, together, I think, with things that have been happening on the political side, have really been creating a feeling of crisis within our society. So what's been going on politically? Well, increasingly, I think people are rebelling against established political authority as well. As wealthy countries have become increasingly diverse, ethno-racially, sexually, and along other dimensions, the reliance on standard democratic majoritarian politics has become impossible, because rule of the majority through standard democracy leads to tyranny of the majority. So we've increasingly relied upon judges or party coalitions between lots of different minority groups, orchestrated by elites to protect minorities against the tyranny of the majority. And yet, majorities and democratic citizens in general feel that this is ridiculous. Whether it protects minorities that the right supports, like gun owners and the wealthy and deeply religious people, or majorities that the left supports, like sexual minorities, migrants, ethno-racial minorities. Increasingly, majorities within these countries feel that this is not a democratic outcome. And they've increasingly turned to reactionary populists of the left and the right, whether they be, Donald Trump and the Brexit movement, or Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, things like this. They're increasingly turning to these movements in order to address this democratic deficit. But these movements don't really offer, I believe, a path forward. They offer the same prescriptions as in the 1950s, the state socialism on the left and the return to a more closed society on the right, which in the end actually are really two sides of the same coin. And what we want to try to offer instead is an ideology based on these ideas of mechanism design that embraces diversity, openness, markets, and technology, and shows how they can actually address these large-scale social problems by embracing dynamism rather than shying away from it. So what I'm going to try to do today is offer you first, I think, the most surprising idea here, the one that most breaks apart our standard political categories. I'll then briefly run through our other proposals, and then I'll wrap that into a broader social vision and movement that we're trying to build around these ideas. So let me start with that first big idea. So we're used to thinking about economic policy as an opposition between some sort of central planning done by the government and capitalism orchestrated by corporations and so forth. And yet, there is an old movement, especially from around the turn of the century, that I was mentioning before, that argues that there's the same problem with both of these. Both government planning and corporate power centralize authority in a small number of hands and deny the ability to have a truly competitive, open, and free market economy. And Henry George, along with others, argued that to have a truly open competitive economy that's truly decentralized, we have to have common ownership of assets that allows for true competition in them. And Henry George's ideas, as manifested especially in his idea that we should have a tax on the full value of all land, and that tax should be used to fund public works and a social dividend for every citizen, because land was not created by any person, but was given to everyone in common by God, that this idea could allow for truly competitive ownership of the land, because no one would just be able to hold on to it and hoard it. They would be forced to pay all of its value into a common pool, and everyone would be able to contest for it. So these ideas were enormously influential on people's imaginations of politics and even on popular culture. So in New York City, here is a billboard that was taken out by a supporter of Henry George, which reads, "Everyone works but the vacant lot. I paid $3,600 for this lot, and I'll hold it till I get $6,000. The profit is an unearned increment made possible by the presence of this community and the enterprise of its people. I take this profit without earning it, and for the remedy read Henry George." Henry George also led to one of the most iconic pieces of American popular culture, really global popular culture at this point. Does anyone recognize what this is?
Monopoly, which was created in
Philadelphia by Elizabeth Magie, except this is not exactly Monopoly. In fact, Monopoly is only one of two sets of rules of this game. This is the landlord's game, and the landlord's game had both the Monopoly set of rules, which you're used to playing, and the progressive or single tax set of rules, which you can also play if you get the original version of this game from Folkopoly Press on eBay. Under those rules, all the land rents associated with the different spots, instead of getting paid to the owner, get paid into a common pool and go to buy out first all the utilities so everyone can use them for free, and then all the railroads so everyone can ride them for free, and then eventually to establish free education for everyone on what used to be the estate of Lord Blueblood. And then eventually, once that's done, they pay a social dividend to everyone who passes this square, which now is called Go. So, despite Henry George's dramatic influence on so much of popular culture, there were some problems with his ideas. And the leading one was that it's very hard for any central government authority to assess what the value of the land is associated with a place. Nor is it even clear that there is a sharp distinction between land and human labor. George wanted 100% tax on the value of land, and labor and anything else that people made to be completely untaxed. But of course, that's kind of an artificial distinction if you think of it. Think of a Van Gogh painting that he made and then in despair threw into a garbage can when he killed himself. Someone maybe years later finds that and makes a huge amount of money, holds it in their apartment so that the Museum of Modern Art can't get access to it, and wants to charge them $1 billion. That's really not any different than someone who happens upon a piece of land that George would have thought should be taxed away and takes it under their private ownership. There's all sorts of ways in which people stumble upon things that end up becoming sort of socially central nodes, whether they become the center of the city in Philadelphia, whether they become Facebook. All these things are in some sense like the land that Henry George described. And so this literal notion of land doesn't quite work. But if you apply his basic idea more broadly, and if you think everything has some mixture of land and labor, it actually suggests some pretty interesting ideas about how you could use common ownership to foster a more competitive and equal society. And I think the most interesting of those ideas was proposed by this gentleman, Arnold Harberger, right around the time that William Vickrey was doing his most pivotal work. And this idea was rediscovered in a paper joint with Anthony Lee Zhang, who's a graduate student at Stanford. And I want to read to you Harberger's own words when he proposed this idea. So he said, if you have to make a base for taxes, adopt criteria that determine the true economic value. The solution the economist offers is simple and direct. Allow the owner to declare the value himself, make these values public, and oblige the owner to sell his property to any person willing to pay the declared value. This system is simple and creates incentives even beyond those existing in the market for assets to be employed in their most productive economic use. So let me give you a sense of what I mean in practice by this system. Let's consider the case of the radio spectrum, which currently gets leased out effectively indefinitely to a bunch of people who then use it to broadcast something or do Wi-Fi or whatever. But the problem is, because they lease this out indefinitely to a bunch of people doing over-the-air broadcasting of both radio and television, which almost nobody uses anymore, stuff is all gummed up. So right now, here's a picture of the fragmented radio spectrum that was put out by the FCC and then transformed by an artist friend of mine. Now you see it's all fractured. But if you want to get a good Wi-Fi system running, you need to get sort of this whole block right here in a nice rectangular position. So imagine that at present, the Q91.5 controls this pink part of the spectrum. Under the system I'm describing, rather than them having an indefinite lease, they'd have to assess a value for this part of the spectrum, and every year pay a fee that's a % of that value to the FCC and stand ready to sell that bit of the spectrum if someone came along to buy it. So they can adjust that price at any time that they want, up to 30 million or down to 10 million. And they would then pay a tax on the time averaged value that they announced. So imagine they did 6 months at 20 million, 6 months at 30 million. They'd pay a 7% tax rate on that average of 25 million, which would be $1.75 million for that year. But that would not just be true of their spectrum. Each one of these blocks would have a price on it, available on a public ledger. And anyone could, at any time, come along, choose a set of blocks that they want, and buy them out. So imagine that you're Verizon, and you want to establish high-quality 5G services here. You might go into an app, circle all of these that you want. Now, what you really want is this part here, but the minimum you need to get it is to buy all these. You'd circle them. You'd add up the values that they had been assessed at. And you'd have to pay $82.3 million to the current owners to buy those out. And then once you've done that, you could package together this part, which you really want, at its new higher value of $1 billion, pay your taxes on that, and then list this part that you don't need at a lower price so that someone will come along and buy it off of you. Okay, so more in detail on this proposal, you would be able to choose your own bundles of property that you buy. You'd have some time to vacate the asset that would depend on the asset type. That would be sort of like the period that you get for an eviction or for a foreclosure on a home. For assets that require some inspection, you could freeze the price, have a right to inspect the asset for some fraction, maybe 1% of its value, and then purchases if you wished. The optimal rate of these taxes will differ across different types of assets. Assets that turn over more frequently to new uses should have a higher tax rate, and in fact, you'll get a price that's exactly equal to the amount the person's willing to accept if the tax rate is equal to the rate of turnover of the asset. These rates should also be lower on assets where it's more important to invest in them, because this is a tax, and like any tax, it reduces your incentive to invest in the asset. Liabilities and mortgages would also be subject to this tax, but in an opposite direction. You'd effectively get a subsidy on your mortgage, and you could tie it to the asset if you wanted, and instead you'd have to accept a refinancing of that mortgage or liability rather than a purchase. Technology would obviously play a central role in making this happen. Blockchain is a very natural substrate for this to allow people to have a publicly accessible ledger, but also AI agents would probably be useful to people in helping them figure out how to assess their assets. And finally, while the tax rate would differ across different assets, we estimate that something like 7% would be an optimal rate overall for the economy, which would raise about 2/3 of the value of returns on capital as tax revenue, which would allow the elimination of all other taxes on capital, all property taxes, corporation income taxes, etc. It would allow paying off of most of the national debt, and at the same time, it would allow a payment of a $24,000 a year social dividend to every citizen. To every family of 4 in the United States. Beyond any direct payments like that, it would have a whole variety of benefits. It would eliminate so much of the time that's wasted on bargaining, because there would be transparent prices on everything. It would eliminate the fact that bargaining fails even when it's efficient, because people are posturing in one direction or the other, or trying to convince other people that their assets are worth more by holding out for more on it. It would penalize people who hoard and hold on to assets lazily, or speculators who come in just to buy up assets and hold on to them without using them. Debt and credit and the whole financial sector would be far less important, because the value of assets would dramatically fall once this tax was imposed. And so the payment to buy something would be basically like the down payment, and then the mortgage payments would be like these payments you'd pay to maintain the asset every month. So basically, this public ledger would substitute for much of the whole financial system. And at the same time, it would dramatically redistribute opportunity. Rather than stability and opportunity being hoarded by the wealthy, they would be much more evenly distributed to everyone. So let me give you an example of that calculation. The median US household has about $60,000 of home equity and about $25,000 of net other assets. Well, the mean per family of 4 value of assets in the US economy is $1 million. Both of these would fall by 2/3 in this world, and that would mean that to maintain your assets at market values, you'd have to pay about $2,000 as a median family, and you'd be getting a $22,500 a year social dividend. That means that even if you overvalued your assets by a factor of 10, so there was almost no chance anyone would ever take them, you'd still come out a winner by about $2,500 under this system. But of course, most people wouldn't do that, and most people would gain much more than this. So what this system really does, even though it seems to be much more unstable, is it actually is only more unstable for people who own their assets outright, which is a tiny fraction of the population. What it actually does is it takes the stability those people enjoy, and it redistributes it more broadly throughout the population so that other people don't need to fear eviction. They don't need to be unable to afford purchasing a home, all those things. Overall, this would reduce inequality by about half of the gap between the current levels of inequality and the trough that it was at mid-century. Now, these may seem like very radical ideas. They are, but there are lots of near-term applications of this. There's the application to the radio spectrum, which we wrote up jointly with Paul Milgram, who designed the original spectrum auctions and is being seriously considered by the FCC. There's all sorts of applications within Ethereum. Vitalik has especially been advocating for using this for domain addresses so that they don't get squatted on within the community. There's interest by the British government in using this for North Sea oil drilling and for landing slots. This is a collaborator at the business secretary's office that we've been talking to about that. And one that I think is particularly interesting and sort of artistic is Simon de la Riviere, who's at Consensus, where I'm actually speaking, and I'm going to get to meet him tomorrow, has the idea of using this for $1 million homepage, one of these sites where everyone owns a pixel, and there's sort of a collaborative process of making a artwork. But beyond these near-term applications, I actually think this much broader and in some ways more disruptive and maybe scary in some ways social applications could actually solve some of the fundamental things that people have been complaining about in capitalism for hundreds or even thousands of years. Capitalism has this tendency by saying, this stuff belongs to me, everything else belongs to someone else, to make people very narrow and selfish in their attachment to objects. In this world, there would be much more fluidity in the same way that sort of the sharing economy has encouraged, where people would expect assets to turn over more and at the same time to have more access to the things that are currently being owned by other people. So they would have all sorts of new entrepreneurial opportunities to access assets while at the same time not having such overwhelming attachment to the things that belong to them. Nor would they have the interest in exploiting the people around them by trying to charge them higher prices. I think one reason many of us have such a nasty taste about market is the most personal market interactions we have when we buy a home or negotiate for a car are awful, because we always know the other side's trying to take advantage of us and we have to try to take advantage of them and do all this bargaining. In this system, there would be transparent and open prices on everything, the way that we buy things in the supermarket, etc. Things would feel much more relaxed and open and fair, because there would be a fair market price on everything. And at the same time, more of our income would come from people in our communities. And we would have an incentive to try to, rather than investing so much in the material possessions we have, invest in the communities around us and the things that create value within those. So that's the first chapter of my book. The other chapters try to take on other fundamental social issues, such as collective decision making, through a system that we call quadratic voting, where to make decisions as a group, rather than one person, one vote, we would allow people to have a budget of tokens that they could spend on whatever issues or candidates are most important to them, so that majorities couldn't oppress minorities, so that citizens would have the ability to weigh in on the issues that are most important to them. And yet the most extreme wouldn't either be able to dominate, because rather than you just being able to put all your tokens on one issue and get proportionally more votes, it would become increasingly expensive to have more influence on one issue the more votes you put on that issue. That's the quadratic nature of the vote. And if it sounds mathematically complex, it's actually quite straightforward if you look at it visually. So that's quadratic voting. The next idea is a new system of migration that would redistribute the benefits of migration so that they don't only accrue to migrants themselves and to the wealthy capitalists and employers who hire those migrants, but rather accrue to every citizen. The idea is that rather than only companies being able to sponsor migrants to come work, like for the H-1B visa, every citizen would have a right to sponsor migrants to work. And in exchange for helping them come to the country, get set up, and taking some responsibility if they commit crimes or end up going on welfare or something like that, they would be able to negotiate with the migrant for a share of the benefit that the migrant receives from coming to the country. This is what we call the Visa Between Individuals program. Fourth, we argue that antitrust is incredibly important to a functional market economy. A market economy isn't a market economy without competition any more than a one-party state is a democracy. And yet we argue that antitrust basically hasn't been tried in practice. Why is that? We argue that most of the actual sources of market power today are completely ignored by antitrust enforcers. In particular, institutional investors like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard own about 20% of the corporate economy. They own American Airlines and Delta. They own United too. They own Walgreens and CVS. And they have no interest in seeing these companies compete with each other. There are 4 of the top 5 investors in 75% of the publicly traded companies. And there's increasing economic evidence that this leads to lower wages, higher prices, and reduced political diversity of opinion. And yet antitrust has done nothing about this, probably the greatest monopoly ever. Second, we argue that companies, and I think this, anyone who's worked a job will know this, have much more power over the people who work for them than they do over the people who buy their products. There's much more competition to sell products than there is in the job market. And yet antitrust has done nothing about the huge consolidation of the labor market that's been taking place over the last 30 or 40 years. Finally, we argue that the data that all of us create every day that gets scooped up by Facebook and Google to power their machine learning systems is really the work that powers those systems. Those AI systems that are supposed to be displacing our jobs, they're not displacing human beings. It's just that the human beings who are working to create all that are not getting compensated. You're basically replacing fooled or slavish labor for work. And in order to stop that from happening, we need to organize people into unions and other organizations that can effectively bargain for a fair share of that output. It's as if when movies came in, rather than having movie stars and the Screen Actors Guild and credits, you went out and just videotaped people on the street without them knowing about it and said that the camera was displacing theater actors, when it was in fact human actors that were. And we argue that's not just bad for the distribution of income, it's bad for productivity, because you would have gotten terrible movies that way. You wouldn't have gotten movie stars and good compositions. You would have gotten whatever crap was lying around. And that's what we're getting in the digital economy. We're not treating human beings like they're serious contributors to these digital systems. So we argue that together, these ideas can truly be transformed. They can truly, for a generation, solve the problems that we were talking about, unlike the snake oil that's sold by the populace. We argue they can grow the economy by 1/3. They can near permanently reduce inequality to the levels it reached at mid-century or is in a place like Sweden. It would double the median income at the same time, while only reducing the effective income of the capitalist class, the wealthy, by about 1/4. It would help, maybe beyond any of these economic things, reconcile the people who feel left behind by globalization and technology and immigration to those forces, actually tie their future to those forces so that they embrace them as enthusiastically as, for example, the working class in China has embraced technological change because they see the benefits from that. And at the same time, they will heal the divides that are separating the rich and the poor world by offering more opportunities for trade and exchange rather than conflict. So we believe these are radical, but actually feasible, unlike the left and right reactionary movements, ways to solve these biggest social problems for a generation. Now, this was a bunch of idealistic ideas, but I've been going around the world talking about these ideas, and there's been an incredible outpouring of enthusiasm and interest from the press, from the blockchain community especially, from policymakers all over the place. And we've built this together into a movement that we're calling RadicalxChange. which is going to be about a 1,000-person DevCon style conference in early March or early April. Jeff Lee Yaw, who I met through at EdCon actually, is the executive director. And we have 4 different tracks. We're trying to get people involved in so many different ways in this movement. Ideas and research led by a historian of the Portuguese Empire, Ananya Chakravarti from Georgetown University. Entrepreneurship and technology led by Mamie Reingold, who's the chair of DevCon 4. Arts and communication led by Jennifer Lynn Marone, a wonderful artist who's done amazing work about data slavery and things like this. And activism and government led by Mark Lutter, who is one of the leading advocates of charter cities and the head of the Center for Innovative Governance. And I hope some of you will have things to contribute in ideas, in entrepreneurship, in art that helps people understand these ideas, and in activism that helps organize people to make them a reality. Thanks so much, and looking forward to your questions.